Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was during that merciless winter of 1895, when London lay buried beneath a siege of snow such as the oldest inhabitants could scarcely recall, that one of the most perplexing cases in my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes first presented itself to our attention. The metropolis had been transformed into a crystalline labyrinth, its familiar thoroughfares rendered nearly impassable by drifts that rose to the second-story windows of many establishments. The very air seemed to bite with malevolent intent, and even the gas lamps struggling against the perpetual curtain of falling snow cast only the most feeble illumination against the encroaching gloom. Within our chambers at 201B Baker Street, we had maintained a comfortable refuge against the elements, though the relentless cold seemed to seep through every crevice despite our roaring fire. Holmes had grown increasingly restless during our enforced confinement, alternating between periods of intense chemical experimentation and those languid stretches where he would pace our sitting room with the measured steps of a caged predator. His keen intellect, deprived of its usual stimulation, had turned to reorganizing his files on criminal anthropology and composing what he claimed would be a definitive treatise on the varieties of tobacco ash found in the drawing rooms of Belgravia. It was on the morning of December 18th, as the storm showed its first signs of abating, that our salvation arrived in the most dramatic fashion. The urgent peal of our doorbell cut through the morning quiet like a blade, followed immediately by Mrs. Hudson's hurried ascent of the 17 steps. Before she could announce our visitor, the door burst open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his usually immaculate appearance thoroughly dishevelled by his battle through the snow-choked streets. "Holmes!" he gasped, removing his snow-laden hat with trembling fingers that betrayed both cold and agitation. "Thank Providence you're here. We have a case that defies all rational explanation, and I fear that without your assistance, justice itself may founder in these drifts." Holmes ceased his restless pacing and turned toward our visitor with that languid grace which always reminded me of a cat that has suddenly detected the scent of cream. His grey eyes, which had held the dull cast of boredom for days, now sparked with unmistakable interest. "Inspector Lestrade," he said, his voice carrying that note of barely contained excitement that I had learned to recognize as the herald of intellectual adventure. "Your appearance suggests a matter of considerable urgency. Pray warm yourself by the fire and tell us what has brought you through this tempest to our door." Lestrade settled himself in the chair opposite Holmes, accepting the brandy I offered, with hands that trembled from more than mere cold. The inspector's weathered face bore the unmistakable marks of a man who had witnessed something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the possible. "It happened 2 nights past," he began, his voice steady despite the obvious strain. "At Ravenshollow Manor in Hampstead, the residence of Sir Reginald Blackwood, the shipping magnate. You'll know the name, Holmes, one of the wealthiest men in London with interests spanning half the empire's trade routes." Holmes had positioned himself in his customary chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of intense concentration. I observed that familiar transformation that occurred whenever a puzzle of sufficient complexity presented itself. The languid detective had vanished, replaced by a mind operating at its highest capacity. "Continue, Inspector. I am familiar with Sir Reginald's reputation, both in business and society. The circumstances of discovery are often as revealing as the crime itself." "Sir Reginald was found dead in his locked study," Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Shot through the heart at close range, the bullet having penetrated with surgical precision. But Holmes, that is merely the beginning of our difficulties. The man was discovered seated at his mahogany desk, his fountain pen still gripped in his right hand, as if he had been interrupted while writing. Upon his face, and I swear this upon my oath, as an officer of the Crown, was the most extraordinary expression I have ever witnessed upon a corpse. "Indeed?" Holmes inquired, leaning forward with the intensity of a hawk sighting its prey. "And what manner of expression was this?" Lestrade's hands trembled as he reached again for his brandy. "He was smiling, Holmes. Not the grimace of pain that one might expect from a man shot through the heart, nor the rictus of death, but a genuine smile of what appeared to be profound satisfaction, as if he had just received the most delightful news imaginable, even as his life's blood was draining away onto his correspondence. The room fell silent, save for the crackling of our fire and the soft whistle of wind through the window frames. Holmes remained motionless for several long moments, his penetrating gaze fixed upon some point beyond Lestrade's shoulder, as his remarkable mind undoubtedly began cataloguing the implications of this singular detail. A man shot through the heart, yet dying with a smile of satisfaction, he mused, his voice carrying that particular quality that indicated his intellectual appetite had been thoroughly awakened. "Tell me, Inspector, was the study truly secured from within, and what of the weapon? Was it discovered at the scene?" "The study was indeed locked from the inside," Lestrade confirmed, his frustration evident in every syllable. "The key was in the lock on the interior side of the door, and we were forced to break it down when Sir Reginald failed to appear for his morning appointment with his solicitor. As for the weapon, that presents yet another impossibility. We found no gun in the room, despite conducting the most thorough search conceivable. Every drawer, every hiding place, every possible concealment was examined. The windows were latched from within, and the snow outside showed no signs of disturbance, not so much as a single footprint leading to or from the house. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a man energized by intellectual challenge. "Fascinating," he murmured, beginning to pace once more, though now his movements held purpose rather than restlessness. "A locked room, a vanished weapon, and a victim who departed this world with an expression of joy. Inspector, you have indeed brought me a puzzle worthy of serious consideration." "Tell me," Holmes continued, pausing at our window to gaze out at the slowly clearing streets, "what manner of man was Sir Reginald? His business affairs, his associates, his enemies? For a man does not amass such wealth without acquiring both friends and foes in equal measure." "Sir Reginald was indeed a wealthy man," Lestrade replied, "though his methods of acquiring that wealth were often questioned in certain circles. His shipping empire made him one of the most powerful figures in London commerce, but his business practices were known to be ruthless. There were whispers of deals that skirted the very edges of legality, of competitors driven to ruin by his machinations. He was unmarried, maintained a small but loyal household staff, and was known to entertain select guests at his manor, though he was generally regarded as a man of stern and unforgiving disposition." "And who discovered the body?" I interjected, my medical training compelling me to seek the practical details that might illuminate this extraordinary mystery. "His personal secretary, a Mr. Pemberton, arrived for their scheduled morning conference and found the study door locked. When Sir Reginald failed to respond to repeated knocking, Pemberton summoned the housekeeper and butler. Together they forced the door, only to discover their master in that ghastly state of smiling death." Holmes had moved closer to the window, his sharp profile silhouetted against the frost-covered glass as he gazed out at the transformed cityscape. "The timing is significant," he observed, his voice carrying that note of calculation that indicated his mind was already several steps ahead of our conversation. 2 nights past places the murder at the very height of the storm. Anyone moving through the streets would have been both highly visible to observers and severely limited in their range of vision. A perfect night for clandestine activity, yet also one that would leave unmistakable evidence of passage in the snow. "Precisely my thoughts, Holmes," Lestrade said, rising from his chair with renewed agitation. "We examined every inch of the ground surrounding Ravenshollow Manor. The snow lay undisturbed save for the normal paths used by the household staff. No footprints led to or from the study windows, no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. It is as if the murderer materialized within the room, committed this impossible deed, and then vanished like smoke into the winter air." The great detective turned from the window, his eyes alight with that particular fire of intellectual pursuit that I had witnessed countless times before, yet which never failed to inspire both admiration and anticipation within me. "Inspector Lestrade," he said, his voice carrying a note of barely suppressed excitement, "I believe you have presented me with exactly the sort of problem that makes existence worthwhile. Watson, if you would be so good as to gather your medical bag and your warmest coat, I believe it is time we paid a visit to Ravenshollow Manor and the late Sir Reginald Blackwood. The game, as they say, is afoot." As I prepared for our expedition into the snow-covered streets of London, I could not help but feel that familiar thrill of anticipation that always accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's investigations. Yet something in Inspector Lestrade's account of the smiling corpse sent an inexplicable chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter weather raging beyond our windows. In my years of partnership with the world's greatest consulting detective, I had witnessed many strange and terrible things, but there was something about the image of a man dying with a smile of profound satisfaction that struck me as particularly unnatural, a detail that suggested depths of mystery far beyond the merely criminal. Little did I know that this case would challenge not only our understanding of the possible, but our very conception of justice itself, leading us through a labyrinth of deception more intricate than the snow-covered streets of London, and toward a resolution that would test even the remarkable powers of Sherlock Holmes. The journey through London's snow-choked arteries proved both arduous and illuminating. Our hansom cab lurched and slid through streets transformed into narrow canyons between towering white embankments, the familiar cityscape rendered alien by winter's relentless siege. Holmes sat forward throughout our passage, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of our transformed surroundings with that peculiar intensity that indicated his remarkable mind was already processing the preliminary elements of our investigation. "Observe, Watson," he remarked suddenly as we struggled past a row of shuttered shops, "how our driver has recently transported a passenger of distinctly nautical profession." I glanced at the seat cushions, noting for the first time the faint, dark stains and the unmistakable odor of tar that clung to the worn leather. "The residue is coal tar varnish, not ship's pitch," Holmes continued, "and those small puncture marks in the horsehair suggest metal studs or buckles pressed with considerable force. A dockyard clerk, I should venture, recently returned from the warehouses and affecting the appearance of greater authority than his station warrants." Inspector Lestrade, who had maintained a brooding silence since our departure, looked up with grudging admiration. "How the devil do you manage such observations, Holmes? It's as if you read the very air around us." "Elementary, my dear Lestrade," Holmes replied with evident satisfaction. "Every surface tells its story to those who possess the patience to listen. In fair weather, such traces might be obscured by the constant traffic of London streets. But this storm has created ideal conditions for preservation of evidence. Which brings us to the central paradox of our case. How does a murderer commit an impossible crime in conditions that should render concealment utterly impossible? As our cab laboured up the steep incline toward Hampstead Heath, Ravenshollow Manor gradually emerged from the swirling snow like some Gothic leviathan rising from a white sea. The imposing Georgian structure commanded its isolated position with stern authority, its dark stone facade rising 3 full stories above grounds that stretched away into the obscuring storm. Tall windows gazed out across the heath like watchful eyes, while ornate chimneys released steady columns of smoke that dissipated quickly in the bitter wind. "Impressive isolation," Holmes murmured, as we approached the main entrance. Sir Reginald chose his residence well for a man who valued privacy in his affairs. The distance from neighbouring houses would have prevented casual observation, yet now works against us in seeking witnesses to any unusual activity. We were received at the door by Jameson, the butler, a man of perhaps 60 years whose dignified bearing could not entirely mask the strain of recent events. Behind him hovered Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, a thin woman whose red-rimmed eyes spoke eloquently of tears recently shed. Most prominently positioned was Pemberton, Sir Reginald's personal secretary, whose pale complexion and trembling hands betrayed the shock of his grisly discovery. "Gentlemen," Pemberton began, his voice barely steady, "I confess I have slept little since finding poor Sir Reginald. The sight of him there with that expression—" He shuddered, unable to continue. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said gently, "your observations may prove crucial. You discovered the body at precisely what time?" 9 o'clock exactly, sir." Sir Reginald maintained absolute punctuality in all matters. When he failed to respond to my knocking, I knew immediately something was wrong. He was never late, never unpunctual. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And the door was definitely secured from within?" Beyond question, I could see the key protruding from the interior lock through the keyhole. Mrs. Hartwell confirmed my observation before we summoned Jameson to force entry. The study itself occupied the manor's eastern corner, its position affording what would normally have been an excellent view across the heath. The room reflected its owner's character, austere yet luxurious, with leather-bound volumes lining dark mahogany walls and a massive desk dominating the centre. Behind this desk, in a high-backed leather chair, sat the mortal remains of Sir Reginald Blackwood, his coarse features transformed by that enigmatic smile of profound satisfaction that had so disturbed Inspector Lestrade. Holmes began his examination with characteristic methodical precision, his magnifying lens revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. The powder burns on the victim's waistcoat indicated a shot fired at close range, while the trajectory suggested the shooter had stood directly before the desk. Most intriguingly, the victim's right hand still gripped his fountain pen, its nib stained with violet ink that had left corresponding marks upon his fingers. "Note the half-completed letter," Holmes murmured, indicating the paper before the corpse. "Addressed to one A. Vale, solicitor, and containing what appears to be a matter of some urgency." He moved to examine the desk's drawers, discovering in the uppermost right compartment an empty recess lined with velvet, clearly designed to hold a revolver that was conspicuously absent. "The weapon's usual resting place," Lestrade observed grimly. "Yet we found no trace of it anywhere in the room." Holmes straightened, his grey eyes alight with intellectual excitement. "Indeed, Inspector. A locked room, a vanished weapon, and a victim who departed this world wearing an expression of triumph. The game, as I remarked earlier, is most decidedly afoot." Holmes moved with characteristic precision to the tall windows that flanked the eastern wall, his keen eyes examining the frost-rimed glass with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient manuscripts. The bitter cold had created delicate traceries of ice along the inner edges of each pane, patterns so intricate and undisturbed that they spoke eloquently of windows that had remained sealed throughout the storm's fury. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, running a gloved finger along the pristine frost formations. "These crystalline formations would shatter at the slightest disturbance. No window in this room has been opened since the temperature dropped below freezing, a period encompassing the entire duration of our blizzard." He tested each latch mechanism with gentle pressure, noting their secure positions before turning his attention to the heavy velvet curtains that framed the glass. While Holmes continued his methodical survey, I approached the corpse with professional detachment, though that enigmatic smile continued to disturb me profoundly. Sir Reginald had been a man of perhaps 55 years, his coarse features bearing the harsh lines of one accustomed to wielding absolute authority in both business and personal affairs. The bullet wound, as Inspector Lestrade had indicated, displayed unmistakable signs of close-range discharge. Powder burns marked the fabric of his expensive waistcoat in a distinctive pattern that spoke of intimate proximity between victim and assassin. The trajectory suggests the shot was fired from directly in front of the desk, I observed, noting the precise angle of entry through the heart. Given the victim's seated position and the wound's location, the shooter would have stood approximately 3 feet away, at roughly the same height as Sir Reginald himself. Most significantly, there are no signs of struggle or defensive wounds. He appears to have made no attempt to protect himself or flee. "Excellent observations, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, though his attention had shifted to the imposing fireplace that dominated the room's western wall. He knelt before the cold hearth, producing his magnifying lens to examine the grate with microscopic attention. "Most illuminating indeed. The ashes here have been disturbed recently, despite Mr. Pemberton's assertion that Sir Reginald rarely used the fire." With delicate movements, Holmes employed his penknife to extract what appeared to be a thread of unusual composition from between the iron bars of the grate. "Silk," he announced, holding the fibre to the light, "but not of ordinary manufacture. This has been doubled and treated with wax, the sort used in mechanical applications rather than feminine attire." He probed deeper into the fireplace, retrieving additional evidence that glittered metallically in the lamplight. Iron filings and traces of gun lubricant mixed with the coal residue. Someone has recently used this hearth for purposes far removed from mere warmth. Inspector Lestrade, observing these discoveries with growing interest, stepped closer to examine Holmes's findings. "What do you make of it, Holmes? Surely you don't suggest the weapon was destroyed in the fire?" "Patience, Inspector," Holmes replied with that maddening composure that had frustrated countless officials throughout his career. "Each piece of evidence must be properly catalogued before we attempt to construct our theory." He turned to address the household staff who had gathered anxiously in the doorway. "Mr. Pemberton, you mentioned that Sir Reginald seemed unusually animated in recent days. Can you provide more specific details about this change in his demeanour?" The secretary wrung his hands nervously as he considered the question. "Sir Reginald received a most unusual visitor on December 14th, a gentleman who refused to provide his name but insisted upon private audience. They met in this very study for nearly 2 hours, and afterward Sir Reginald appeared almost triumphant, if I may use such a word. He hummed while reviewing correspondence, something I had never witnessed in 15 years of service." "Triumphant?" Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest. In what specific manner did this manifest itself? He made several cryptic remarks about justice finally being served and accounts being settled at last, Pemberton continued, his voice growing more confident as he recalled the details. Most peculiarly, he instructed me to prepare correspondence to his solicitor regarding significant changes to his will, though he never dictated the specific contents of those alterations. Holmes carefully extracted the half-completed letter from beneath the corpse's rigid grip, noting the distinctive violet ink that had formed a small blot where the pen had fallen from the dying man's grasp. Addressed to one A. Vale, solicitor. The very correspondence you were instructed to prepare, Mr. Pemberton, and written upon paper of exceptional quality, heavily watermarked, and quite different from Sir Reginald's usual business stationery. The butler, Jameson, stepped forward with evident reluctance. If I may, sir, there was also Captain Silas Reed of the steamship Harfang, who visited that same afternoon, a rough-spoken gentleman, but one known to the household for many years. Sir Reginald seemed particularly eager to receive him. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his remarkable mind already beginning to weave these disparate threads into a coherent pattern. And were there any other visitors during this period of Sir Reginald's unusual behaviour? One other, sir, Jameson replied. Mr. Lionel Draper from Baltic Star, competitors to Sir Reginald's shipping interests. He left his card but was not received, though Sir Reginald seemed quite pleased by his attempted visit. As Holmes absorbed this information, I found myself drawn once again to that disturbing smile, its implications growing more troubling with each moment of contemplation. The physiological impossibility of maintaining such serene satisfaction while experiencing violent death suggested complexities far beyond ordinary murder, hinting at depths of deception that would challenge even my friend's remarkable powers of deduction. Holmes approached the imposing mahogany desk with renewed purpose, his long fingers tracing the polished surface as he systematically examined each drawer with the methodical precision that had become his hallmark. The uppermost drawer revealed the expected implements of correspondence, sealing wax, various stamps, and an assortment of expensive fountain pens arranged with military precision. However, it was in the locked lower drawer, whose key Holmes discovered hidden beneath the desk blotter, that our investigation took its first significant turn. "Most illuminating," he murmured, extracting a leather-bound ledger whose pages were filled with entries written in Sir Reginald's distinctive hand. The volume appeared to be a private accounting of transactions that would never appear in any official business records. "Observe, Watson, substantial sums paid to various individuals, all identified only by initials and all bearing dates within the past 6 months. I leaned closer to examine the curious entries, noting the irregular amounts and the strange symbols that accompanied many of the transactions. Small drawings of nautical instruments, anchors, compass roses, and ship's wheels decorated the margins, suggesting connections to Sir Reginald's maritime empire, yet remaining tantalizingly cryptic in their precise meaning. "Blackmail payments?" Inspector Lestrade suggested, with the eagerness of a man who believed he had identified a clear motive for murder. "Possibly," Holmes replied with characteristic caution, "though the amounts are curiously irregular, and several entries bear markings that suggest something more complex than simple extortion." He indicated a series of dates that corresponded precisely with the recent visits mentioned by the household staff. "Note how these entries coincide with the arrivals of our mysterious visitors, a pattern that suggests careful orchestration rather than random criminal activity." Our examination was interrupted by Mrs. Hartwell, who had remained silent throughout our investigation, but now stepped forward with evident agitation. "If I may speak, gentlemen, there was something most peculiar about Sir Reginald's behaviour on the night he died. I was preparing to retire when I heard voices from this study, not merely his own, but at least one other person engaged in what seemed to be animated conversation." Holmes's attention focused upon her with laser-like intensity, recognizing immediately the potential significance of this revelation. "What time was this, Mrs. Hartwell? And can you describe the nature of this conversation?" "It was past 11 o'clock, sir, well beyond Sir Reginald's usual retiring hour. The voices were muffled by the heavy door, but I distinctly heard laughter. Sir Reginald's laughter, which was most unusual, given his generally stern disposition. There was also another voice, deeper and more gruff, though I could not make out specific words. "And how long did this conversation continue?" Holmes inquired, his grey eyes alight with the fire of discovery. "Perhaps 20 minutes, sir." Then there was a period of silence, followed by what sounded like furniture being moved about. I assumed Sir Reginald was rearranging his desk for some purpose, and thought no more of it until... She gestured helplessly toward the corpse, unable to complete her sentence. Holmes began pacing the room with renewed energy, his remarkable mind clearly processing this new information alongside the physical evidence he had already gathered. The timeline was becoming clearer. A late-night visitor, animated conversation, laughter from a man known for his stern demeanor, followed by mysterious sounds and, ultimately, death. Yet the locked room remained as impossible as ever, and that enigmatic smile continued to mock our attempts at rational explanation. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said suddenly, turning to address the secretary, "you mentioned that Sir Reginald intended to alter his will significantly. I require details about his current testamentary arrangements and who stands to benefit from his death." Pemberton adjusted his spectacles nervously before responding. "Sir Reginald's existing will, drawn up 5 years ago, bequeaths the bulk of his considerable estate to a distant cousin, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who resides in Cornwall. She is a woman of modest means, and while they corresponded occasionally, their relationship was not particularly close. The remainder was divided among various charities and trusted employees." "And the proposed changes?" Holmes pressed, his voice carrying that note of intensity that indicated he sensed the approach of crucial information. He stated only that they would be significant and would reflect recent developments. He was most insistent about contacting Mr. A. Vale, his solicitor, to arrange an appointment for today, the very day he was discovered dead. Holmes paused in his pacing, his sharp features reflecting the profound concentration that indicated his remarkable mind was beginning to perceive patterns invisible to ordinary observation. So, Mrs. Vance faced the imminent loss of a substantial inheritance, while someone else, someone connected to these recent developments, stood to gain considerably from Sir Reginald's death before he could execute these changes. "There's also the matter of Captain Silas Reed," Jameson interjected with evident reluctance. "He has commanded Sir Reginald's flagship for many years, but there have been recent disagreements about certain business practices. The captain had been making inquiries into ventures that had gone poorly, particularly in the East Indies, and was quite vocal about his concerns." Inspector Lestrade's eyes brightened with the prospect of tangible suspects. 2 clear motives, a disinherited cousin and a disgruntled employee with intimate knowledge of the house and Sir Reginald's habits. Either could have gained access, committed the murder, and escaped by some means we have not yet discovered. Holmes, however, remained thoughtful, his gaze returning repeatedly to that disturbing smile that transformed Sir Reginald's coarse features. "While both Mrs. Vance and Captain Reed present compelling motives, Inspector, we must not allow the obvious to blind us to the fundamental impossibility of this crime. A man does not smile with such profound satisfaction while being murdered, nor does a killer vanish from a locked room carrying a missing weapon through a blizzard that should preserve every trace of passage." As we prepared to conclude our initial examination of the study, I found myself increasingly troubled by the psychological implications of our discoveries. The evidence suggested not merely a carefully planned murder, but an elaborate deception that challenged our very understanding of what constituted possible criminal behavior. Holmes's methodical approach was revealing layer upon layer of complexity, yet the central mystery, how a man could be murdered in an impossible fashion, while maintaining an expression of triumph, remained as baffling as ever. Inspector Lestrade, Holmes said quietly as we gathered our materials. "I believe we are confronting something far more sophisticated than a conventional murder. The evidence suggests a carefully orchestrated performance, one designed to mislead even the most experienced investigators. Before we can identify our culprit, we must first understand the true nature of the crime itself." The game, as Holmes had observed, was indeed afoot, but I sensed that we had barely begun to comprehend the rules by which this particular contest would be played. Holmes moved with renewed purpose to examine the study door itself, his keen eyes focusing upon details that had escaped our initial observation. Kneeling beside the threshold, he produced his magnifying lens and directed Jameson to bring additional light from the corridor. The flickering candlelight revealed what daylight had concealed, a faint, glistening residue along the narrow gap between door and frame. "Most illuminating," he murmured, carefully scraping a minute sample with his penknife. "Sealing wax, Watson, applied with considerable precision." He rose and addressed the assembled household staff with characteristic directness. "Mrs. Hartwell, I require your sewing basket, if you would be so kind." The housekeeper returned promptly with a wicker container filled with the usual implements of domestic needlework. Holmes selected a length of fine silk thread, examining its texture and weight with professional interest. "Observe, Inspector," he said, demonstrating with careful movements, "how such thread, when properly treated with wax for stiffness, might be passed beneath a door and manipulated to engage the key from without." With deft fingers, he fashioned a small loop and demonstrated the technique, showing how the key could be turned from the corridor side through patient manipulation. The wax residue, we discovered, served to hold the arrangement in place during the crucial moments. Afterward, the thread would be withdrawn and destroyed, likely in the very fireplace where we found those curious iron filings. Inspector Lestrade watched this demonstration with growing excitement, yet Holmes's expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. While this explains the mechanical possibility of locking the room from outside, it does nothing to address our more fundamental mysteries: the vanished weapon, the victim's inexplicable expression of satisfaction, or the complete absence of footprints in the snow surrounding the manor. Holmes returned to his examination of the fireplace, this time focusing his attention upon the arrangement of the coal scuttle and fire irons. With methodical precision, he lifted each implement, noting their positions and examining their surfaces for any trace of disturbance. It was beneath the coal scuttle's lining that his efforts were rewarded, a small brass fitting scorched and bearing the unmistakable marks of mechanical stress. "A clamp of some description," he announced, holding the device to the light. "Designed to secure an object firmly in position, yet small enough to be easily concealed. Note the screw threads and the pattern of wear. This has seen recent use in a most specific application." Pemberton stepped forward with evident curiosity. "Sir Reginald was not mechanically inclined, Mr. Holmes. Such a device would be entirely foreign to his usual possessions." "Indeed," Holmes replied, carefully wrapping the clamp in his handkerchief. "Which suggests it was brought here for a particular purpose and subsequently hidden among the fireplace implements where it might escape casual observation." Our attention was next drawn to Sir Reginald's mahogany desk, where Holmes employed a technique I had witnessed on previous occasions. Taking a soft pencil from the desk drawer, he carefully shaded the surface of the blotting paper, revealing the ghostly impressions left by previous correspondence. Gradually, words emerged from the seemingly blank surface, like spirits materializing from the ether. "Most revealing," Holmes murmured as the text became legible. "2A Vale, bring codicil draft immediately. Harfang claims investigation complete. Evidence now secured. Draper partnership terminated. Justice, finally." The remainder of the message was lost where the paper had been torn or removed. Mrs. Hartwell clasped her hands together in recognition. That explained Sir Reginald's unusual mood in recent days. He spoke repeatedly of settling old accounts and seemed almost cheerful about some business matter that had long troubled him. The Harfang, Holmes mused, his grey eyes alight with interest. Captain Reed's vessel, if I'm not mistaken, and Mr. Draper of Baltic Star, a competitor whose attempted visit was mentioned by your butler. The pattern begins to emerge, though its full significance remains obscured. As Holmes continued his methodical investigation, I found myself increasingly troubled by the psychological implications of our discoveries. The evidence suggested elaborate preparation and careful timing, yet the victim's expression of profound satisfaction remained inexplicable. No man smiles with such serene contentment while facing violent death, unless— Holmes, I ventured, is it possible that Sir Reginald was somehow complicit in his own demise? That smile suggests not surprise or terror, but rather the satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. An astute observation, Watson, Holmes replied, though his tone suggested he was not yet ready to fully explore this line of reasoning. The psychological evidence is indeed as significant as the physical. A man does not die smiling from a gunshot wound unless his death serves some purpose he values more than life itself. Inspector Lestrade, growing impatient with these philosophical considerations, pressed for more immediate action. Holmes, we have clear evidence of how the room was locked from outside. We have identified several suspects with compelling motives, and we have established that Sir Reginald was involved in some form of business intrigue. Surely it is time to make arrests and extract confessions through proper interrogation. Patience, Inspector, Holmes cautioned, his voice carrying that note of authority that brooked no argument. We have indeed made progress in understanding the mechanics of this crime, but we have barely begun to comprehend its true nature. The locked room was merely the stage dressing for a far more sophisticated performance, one designed to mislead even the most experienced investigators. He paused at the study window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds, with that distant expression that indicated his remarkable mind was processing information at levels beyond ordinary comprehension. Before we can identify our culprit, we must first understand whether we are investigating a murder, a suicide, or something altogether more complex. The evidence suggests possibilities that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of crime itself. As we prepared to leave Ravenshollow Manor for further investigations in London, I could not shake the feeling that we had barely scratched the surface of this extraordinary mystery. Holmes had solved the puzzle of the locked room and discovered evidence of careful preparation, yet the central questions remained as baffling as ever. The game was indeed afoot, but the rules by which it was being played remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp, hidden behind that enigmatic smile that seemed to mock our every attempt at rational explanation. The return journey to London proved as enlightening as our investigation at Ravenshollow Manor, though Holmes maintained that contemplative silence which I had learned never to disturb when his remarkable mind was processing the intricate details of a complex case. The storm had begun to abate, revealing glimpses of the familiar cityscape through the dissipating snow, yet the streets remained treacherous enough to require our driver's utmost skill in navigation. "The dead man's pen points us as surely as any compass, Watson," Holmes observed suddenly as we approached Chancery Lane. "Mr. A. Vale first, the solicitor whose urgent appointment was never kept." We found Mr. Vale in chambers that reflected their occupant's character, orderly, precise, and scrupulously maintained. He was a small, clean-shaven gentleman whose composure faltered visibly at the mention of Sir Reginald's name. From his private safe he produced a leather file containing correspondence that would prove crucial to our understanding of the case. "Sir Reginald sent this yesterday by special messenger," Vale explained, presenting a brief note bearing Blackwood's distinctive seal. "Urgent. Attend at 10. Codicil of weight. Secrecy essential." The solicitor's voice carried undertones of genuine distress as he continued. 3 days ago, he outlined his intention to revoke entirely the bequest to Mrs. Eleanor Vance and create instead a substantial trust for those who have paid with their lives for the prosperity of others. He spoke specifically of certain crews engaged on his eastern shipping routes. Holmes leaned forward with unmistakable interest. Did he elaborate upon the nature of these obligations to deceased mariners? He was most animated, almost exultant about possessing proof sufficient to expose what he termed systematic fraud and deliberate sabotage perpetrated by competitors. He mentioned specifically the dissolution of all agreements with Mr. Lionel Draper of Baltic Star, whom he accused of criminal conspiracy involving falsified manifests and substituted cargo. Our next destination led us through the snow-choked streets to the London docks, where the Thames flowed like molten lead between frost-whitened piers. The steamship Harfang lay moored among vessels whose masts rose like blackened spears into the grey sky. Captain Silas Reed received us on his quarterdeck, a weathered mariner whose direct gaze and steady bearing spoke of decades commanding vessels in every conceivable weather. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I expected your visit. The Yard have been here, but I suspect you seek different answers." He gestured toward his cabin, where we found refuge from the bitter wind. "Sir Reginald engaged me 3 months ago in an unusual commission to investigate the loss of the merchant vessel Cassandra, which foundered in the South China Sea 2 years past with considerable loss of life." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with intense interest. The official determination attributed her loss to severe weather conditions. "That was the public conclusion," Reed confirmed grimly. Though Sir Reginald suspected deliberate sabotage, the Cassandra carried cargo of exceptional value, not merely commercial goods, but certain documents and artifacts that were irreplaceable. My investigation revealed that her manifest had been falsified, key crew members replaced at the last moment by individuals with questionable backgrounds, and her route altered without proper authorization. The captain's weathered hands trembled slightly as he continued. "Most significantly, I discovered that Mr. Draper of Baltic Star had made detailed inquiries about the Cassandra's cargo shortly before her departure. The vessel was not merely sabotaged, Mr. Holmes. Her loss was orchestrated as part of an elaborate insurance fraud. The valuable cargo was secretly offloaded before sailing, while worthless substitutes were placed aboard to maintain the deception." As Captain Reed concluded his extraordinary account, Holmes began pacing the confined space with renewed energy, his remarkable mind clearly processing this revelation alongside the physical evidence we had gathered. "You delivered these findings to Sir Reginald personally?" "On the evening of December 14th, he was jubilant, spoke of finally possessing evidence necessary to bring justice to those who thought themselves beyond its reach. He intended to expose the fraud publicly and ensure proper compensation for the victims' families." Holmes paused at the cabin's small window, gazing out at the ice-choked river with that distant expression indicating profound calculation. "The pattern becomes increasingly clear, Watson. Sir Reginald possessed evidence of criminal conspiracy involving insurance fraud, deliberate sabotage, and the calculated destruction of human life for commercial gain. His intended codicil would have diverted his fortune to compensate the victims' families, while simultaneously exposing those responsible." "Yet he died with that expression of profound satisfaction," I observed, still troubled by this psychological impossibility. "Indeed," Holmes replied, quietly. A man does not smile with such serene triumph while facing violent death unless his demise serves some purpose he values more than life itself. The theatrical nature of this crime suggests we are confronting not merely murder, but an elaborate performance designed to mislead even experienced investigators. Before we can identify our true adversary, we must understand whether we are investigating a conventional homicide or something altogether more sophisticated. As we prepared to leave the Harfang, I could not escape the feeling that we had barely begun to comprehend the true scope of this extraordinary conspiracy, one that challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of crime itself. Our departure from the Harfang was marked by Holmes's characteristic silence, though I observed that his grey eyes held that particular intensity which indicated his remarkable mind was processing the implications of Captain Reed's extraordinary revelations. The bitter wind seemed to carry the weight of conspiracy as we made our way through London's snow-laden streets, the familiar cityscape transformed into a crystalline maze that reflected the labyrinthine nature of our investigation. "The pattern becomes increasingly clear, Watson," Holmes observed suddenly as our cab lurched through the treacherous thoroughfares. Sir Reginald possessed evidence of systematic fraud involving the deliberate destruction of vessels and the calculated sacrifice of human lives for commercial gain. His intended exposure of this conspiracy, coupled with his proposed changes to his will, placed him in mortal peril from individuals with access to substantial resources and maritime expertise. The urgency of our situation was emphasized by the arrival of a messenger bearing correspondence from Mr. Lionel Draper of Baltic Star, requesting immediate audience and claiming possession of information vital to our investigation. Holmes examined the hastily written note with characteristic attention to detail, noting the quality of paper, the tremor in the handwriting, and the distinctive watermark that suggested documents of considerable importance. We found Mr. Draper in offices that reflected both commercial success and recent anxiety. The man himself proved to be of middle years, his florid complexion and nervous gestures betraying strain that extended far beyond ordinary business concerns. His hands trembled visibly as he received us, and his eyes held that haunted quality I had observed in men confronting circumstances beyond their control. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, his voice barely steady, "I understand you are investigating Sir Reginald's death, and I fear I possess information that may prove both relevant and damaging to my own reputation." From his desk drawer he produced a leather portfolio containing documents that bore official seals and signatures. "Sir Reginald confronted me 3 days ago with evidence of irregularities in certain shipping manifests, irregularities that implicated my company in activities that skirted the very edges of legality." Holmes leaned forward with unmistakable interest, his penetrating gaze focusing upon Draper with laser-like intensity. These irregularities concerned systematic insurance fraud involving the deliberate destruction of merchant vessels, I presume. Draper's face paled visibly at this direct accusation. "Among other vessels, yes. The Cassandra was merely one ship among many, part of a pattern of deliberate destruction designed to conceal the theft of valuable cargo while generating substantial insurance settlements. I was approached 2 years ago by individuals claiming to represent foreign investors, offering substantial payments for what they termed routing assistance. I believed initially that I was facilitating legitimate commerce, though I confess the secrecy surrounding these arrangements should have aroused my suspicions." As Draper continued his confession, the true magnitude of the conspiracy became apparent. The corruption extended far beyond simple commercial fraud, involving forged documents, bribed customs officials, insurance adjusters, and even certain members of the maritime courts. The coordination required for such systematic deception implied the participation of individuals with access to official records, shipping schedules, and governmental documentation. Sir Reginald arrived here in a state of barely controlled fury. On December 14th, Draper continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He accused me of complicity in murder and claimed that my routing assistance had directly contributed to the deaths of innocent mariners. He demanded complete cessation of all such activities and threatened public exposure if I refused cooperation. Holmes had been examining the documents with characteristic thoroughness, his sharp features reflecting profound calculation. While Draper spoke, I observed that Holmes's attention had been drawn to subtle details. A faint smudge of soot mixed with grease at the inner edge of Draper's right cuff, the lingering scent of bergamot oil that seemed incongruous with maritime business, and the nervous manner in which the man's eyes avoided direct contact during crucial portions of his testimony. You agreed to Sir Reginald's demands, yet arranged to meet with him on the evening of his death, Holmes observed, with deceptive casualness. What was the nature of this final appointment? Draper's composure faltered entirely at this direct question. That is to say, Sir Reginald did indeed request such a meeting, but the storm made travel impossible. The roads were impassable, and I feared for my safety in such conditions. Yet someone did visit Sir Reginald that evening, Holmes noted with characteristic precision. Mrs. Hartwell heard voices in animated conversation well past his usual retiring hour. If not you, then who possessed both the motive and the means to reach Ravenshollow Manor through the worst blizzard in recent memory? Our interview was interrupted by the arrival of an urgent message from Mr. Vale, the solicitor, reporting that his chambers had been burglarized and the crucial Blackwood files stolen. Holmes's expression sharpened with unmistakable interest as he read the hastily written note, recognizing immediately the significance of this development. "The game accelerates, Watson," he murmured, as we prepared to depart Baltic Star's offices. "Our adversary grows desperate, which makes him both more dangerous and more likely to make the crucial error that will expose his identity." We found Mr. Vale's chambers in a state of controlled chaos. Drawers gaped open, papers lay scattered across the floor, and the supposedly secure safe stood violated with its contents removed. Yet Holmes's examination of the scene revealed evidence that the ordinary eye would miss entirely. At the window overlooking the narrow mews, he discovered traces of Stockholm tar and sugar of lead embedded in the snow that had blown upon the sill, along with a short filament of waxed silk caught upon a splinter of the window frame. "Not a common housebreaker," Holmes observed, kneeling to examine faint impressions in the carpet beneath the window. An improviser with maritime habits, as evidenced by the heel plate pattern, a star design uncommon outside nautical suppliers. The waxed silk thread suggests someone familiar with rigging and rope work, while the tar and lead compounds indicate recent contact with ship maintenance materials. As we returned to Baker Street through the gradually clearing streets, Holmes began formulating his response to these latest developments. The theft of the crucial documents had been intended to cripple the investigation, yet Holmes recognized it as an opportunity to force our adversary into the open through carefully orchestrated pressure. "The burglar believes he has eliminated the evidence necessary to expose the conspiracy," Holmes explained as we settled before our fire. "His confidence will make him careless, and carelessness in a criminal of such sophistication will prove fatal to his cause." Holmes spent the remainder of the evening composing a series of carefully worded messages, notices to be placed in the agony columns of various newspapers, letters to be delivered to specific addresses, and instructions for Inspector Lestrade regarding surveillance of key suspects. Each communication was designed to create the impression that duplicate evidence existed and that the investigation was proceeding despite the theft. "The smile, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice carrying that note of revelation that indicated a crucial insight. "It remains the key to understanding the true nature of this crime. A man does not die with such profound satisfaction unless his death serves some purpose he values more than life itself. We are not investigating a conventional murder, but rather an elaborate performance designed to achieve objectives that extend far beyond the mere elimination of Sir Reginald Blackwood." As the evening progressed and the storm finally began to abate, I sensed that we were approaching the climactic phase of this extraordinary case. Holmes's methodical investigation had revealed the scope of the conspiracy and identified the key players, yet the identity of the actual murderer remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. The game was indeed afoot, but the rules by which it was being played challenged our fundamental understanding of criminal behavior, leading us toward a resolution that would test even the remarkable powers of Sherlock Holmes. The stage was set for the final act of this deadly drama, with Holmes preparing to use his accumulated evidence to force the true culprit into revealing himself through actions that would expose the elaborate deception that had begun with a man who smiled in the face of death. The following morning brought validation of Holmes's strategic patience in the most dramatic fashion. The agony columns of 3 major newspapers bore the subtle fruit of his midnight labors, cryptic notices designed to suggest that duplicate evidence existed and that the investigation continued despite the theft at Mr. Vale's chambers. To AV, secondary proof secured, Harfang documents confirmed, "Justice approaches with the tide," read one particularly pointed message in the Times. Holmes stood at our window, observing the gradual transformation of London's snow-covered streets as the first signs of thaw began to appear. "The psychological pressure is mounting, Watson," he remarked with quiet satisfaction. Our adversary believed that eliminating Mr. Vale's files would cripple our investigation. These notices will convince him that his desperate gamble has failed entirely. The effectiveness of Holmes's campaign became apparent when young Wiggins arrived with intelligence from the docks. The former street urchin, now one of Holmes's most reliable informants, brought news that sent a visible thrill of excitement through my friend's lean frame. "Mr. Holmes," Wiggins reported, his voice carrying the gravity of significant discovery, "there's been unusual activity down at Shadwell. Captain Finch of the merchant vessel Prospero has been making urgent inquiries about immediate passage to Lisbon, unusual for a man known to plan his voyages months in advance. More significant still, he's been approached by a gentleman matching the description of our mysterious burglar, offering substantial payment for discretion and speed." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest as he consulted his detailed map of London's maritime districts. Captain Finch operates in the shadows of legitimate commerce, facilitating the movement of individuals and cargo that prefer to avoid official scrutiny. His sudden urgency suggests our psychological campaign has achieved its intended effect. Someone believes they must flee the country immediately. Our surveillance of the Prospero required careful coordination with Inspector Lestrade, whose initial skepticism had given way to grudging admiration for Holmes's methods. We positioned ourselves in the maze of warehouses surrounding Shadwell Basin, where the merchant vessel lay moored among a forest of masts and rigging that provided excellent concealment for our observation. The afternoon brought developments that exceeded even Holmes's expectations. A figure emerged from the narrow lanes leading to the docks, a man of middle years whose expensive overcoat and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority in maritime circles. Yet something in his furtive glances and hurried pace betrayed the anxiety that Holmes's campaign had successfully instilled. "Mr. Lionel Draper," Holmes murmured with satisfaction as we observed the shipping magnate's approach to the Prospero. His presence here confirms our suspicions about the true scope of this conspiracy. The man who professed cooperation with our investigation is preparing to abandon England entirely. Through our concealed position, we witnessed Draper's animated conversation with Captain Finch, noting the exchange of what appeared to be substantial payment and the transfer of a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained documents of crucial importance. The psychological pressure of believing that evidence still existed had driven him to precisely the desperate action Holmes had anticipated. However, it was the arrival of a second figure that transformed our understanding of the case entirely. From the shadows of the warehouse district emerged a man whose appearance sent a shock of recognition through both Holmes and myself. Mr. Pemberton, Sir Reginald's trusted secretary, the very individual who had discovered the body and provided crucial testimony about his employer's final days. "Extraordinary," Holmes breathed, his voice carrying that note of intellectual excitement that indicated a crucial piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The faithful secretary, the man who seemed so genuinely shocked by his master's death, is revealed as an active participant in the conspiracy he was supposedly helping us investigate. We observed as Pemberton joined Draper in urgent conference with Captain Finch, their animated gestures suggesting disagreement about the timing and logistics of their planned escape. Through Holmes's field glasses, I could see that Pemberton carried a small leather case that he guarded with particular care, undoubtedly containing evidence or documents that he considered essential to his survival. Holmes signalled to Inspector Lestrade, who had positioned himself with several constables at the warehouse's far entrance. The trap that had been weeks in the making was about to close with decisive finality. Yet even as we prepared to move, Holmes's attention was drawn to a detail that would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of Sir Reginald's death. "Observe Pemberton's hands, Watson," Holmes whispered urgently. "Note the distinctive staining on his fingers, not ink, as one might expect from a secretary, but the telltale residue of photographic chemicals, silver nitrate and potassium bromide, if I'm not mistaken, suggesting recent work in a photographic darkroom." The implication struck me with the force of revelation. The evidence Sir Reginald possessed, it was photographic proof of the conspiracy, not merely written documents. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed as we began our approach. And Pemberton, with his access to Sir Reginald's private study and his knowledge of photography, was uniquely positioned to create duplicate evidence while simultaneously planning his master's elimination. The confrontation itself unfolded with the swift precision that marked all of Holmes's carefully orchestrated plans. As Lestrade's men secured the warehouse exits, we emerged from concealment to find ourselves facing the three conspirators whose desperation had finally exposed their true identities. Draper's face paled visibly at our appearance, while Captain Finch made a futile attempt to reach his vessel before being restrained by the waiting constables. It was Pemberton, however, whose reaction proved most revealing. Rather than showing surprise or attempting flight, he stood with that same expression of resigned satisfaction that had marked Sir Reginald's features in death. The look of a man whose carefully laid plans had finally reached their intended conclusion. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said with quiet authority, "I believe you have considerable explaining to do about the true circumstances of Sir Reginald Blackwood's death, and particularly about why a man died with a smile of profound satisfaction while facing the barrel of his own revolver. As the constable secured our prisoners, I realized that we had finally reached the threshold of the truth behind the man who smiled in the blizzard. The psychological trap Holmes had so carefully constructed had not merely captured the fleeing conspirators, it had revealed the mastermind whose elaborate deception had challenged our fundamental understanding of what constituted possible criminal behavior. The game was approaching its climactic resolution with Holmes preparing to unveil the extraordinary truth behind one of the most psychologically complex murders in our long partnership. The warehouse fell into profound silence as Holmes's accusation hung in the salt-tinged air. Inspector Lestrade's men had secured Draper and Finch, yet it was Pemberton whose reaction proved most revealing. Rather than showing surprise or attempting denial, the secretary stood with that same expression of resigned satisfaction we had witnessed upon Sir Reginald's features in death. The look of a man whose carefully orchestrated plan had reached its inevitable conclusion. "The photographic evidence was indeed your insurance policy, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes continued with characteristic precision, "yet it served a far nobler purpose than mere self-preservation. You and Sir Reginald collaborated in the most extraordinary deception I have encountered in my career. A carefully choreographed performance designed to ensure justice for the victims of systematic maritime fraud." Pemberton's composure began to crack under the weight of Holmes's penetrating analysis. His hands trembled as he clutched the leather portfolio containing the crucial photographic plates. "You understand everything, don't you, Mr. Holmes?" he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of profound exhaustion mixed with strange relief. 15 years I served Sir Reginald faithfully, watching him grow wealthy from ventures that cost innocent lives. But in his final months, something changed within him. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes reflecting the profound calculation that indicated his remarkable mind had finally assembled the complete picture. Captain Reed's investigation of the Cassandra incident served as Sir Reginald's moral awakening. When confronted with undeniable evidence of the conspiracy's human cost, he experienced what he termed a crisis of conscience that transformed him from participant to avenger. "Sir Reginald summoned me to his study on December 14th, Pemberton continued, his voice growing stronger with the relief of finally unburdening himself. He had discovered my photographic documentation of the conspiracy's evidence and realized its true purpose. Rather than prosecuting me for what he initially suspected was blackmail, he proposed something far more extraordinary, a collaboration that would ensure complete exposure of the fraud while providing undeniable proof of his own remorse. Inspector Lestrade stepped forward with obvious confusion. "Are you suggesting that Sir Reginald was complicit in his own death?" "More than complicit, Inspector," Holmes replied with quiet authority. "Sir Reginald orchestrated his own demise as the final act in an elaborate performance designed to achieve justice for victims whose deaths had enriched the very men who caused them. The smile we observed was not the rictus of violent death, but the serene satisfaction of a man who had finally achieved redemption through ultimate sacrifice." Holmes began pacing the confined space with renewed energy as the full scope of the deception became clear. The locked room was indeed secured from outside using the waxed silk technique, but not by a fleeing murderer. Mr. Pemberton remained in the study after Sir Reginald's death, carefully arranging the scene to create the appearance of impossible murder rather than deliberate suicide. "The weapon disposal was elegantly simple," Holmes continued, addressing the mechanical aspects with characteristic precision. "Sir Reginald's own revolver was secured beneath his desk using the brass clamp we discovered. A silk line, led through a carefully prepared guide, was attached to the trigger mechanism. When Sir Reginald completed his final letter, his confession and testament, he activated the device himself, ensuring the bullet struck with lethal precision while his mind dwelt upon the justice he was finally achieving." Pemberton nodded slowly, his features reflecting the exhaustion of carrying an impossible secret. The recoil drew the weapon into the fireplace through a prepared opening in the desk's back panel. I had already built up the fire with materials that would ensure complete destruction of the evidence, coal treated with chemicals that would consume metal as well as wood. Sir Reginald recognized that conventional prosecution would be insufficient, Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of admiration reserved for intellectual achievements of the highest order. Men of wealth and influence rarely face true consequences for their crimes, but a mysterious murder would ensure thorough investigation, while the photographic evidence you possessed would ultimately expose the entire network of corruption. Pemberton opened the leather portfolio with trembling hands, revealing glass plates that documented years of systematic fraud. Every forged manifest, every falsified insurance claim, every document that contributed to the deaths of innocent mariners. Sir Reginald spent his final months gathering this evidence, driven by guilt over his own participation in ventures that enriched him while destroying countless lives. Holmes examined the plates with professional interest, noting the exceptional quality of the photographic work and the damning nature of the documented evidence. The conspiracy extends far beyond shipping fraud, involving customs officials, insurance adjusters, maritime courts, and commercial enterprises throughout the empire. Sir Reginald's death has served as the catalyst for exposing corruption on a scale that would have been impossible to prosecute through conventional means. As the constables prepared to transport our prisoners, Holmes addressed the broader implications of what we had witnessed. Sir Reginald Blackwood achieved in death what he could never have accomplished in life, the complete exposure of systematic fraud and the promise of justice for victims whose sacrifices had been dismissed as acceptable commercial losses. I found myself profoundly moved by the psychological complexity of a case that had challenged our fundamental understanding of criminal behavior. The man who smiled in the blizzard had transformed his own culpability into a weapon against the conspiracy that had enriched him, choosing ultimate sacrifice over comfortable complicity. The photographic evidence will ensure that justice reaches every participant in this network of maritime fraud, Holmes concluded as we prepared to leave Shadwell Basin. Mr. Pemberton's courage in preserving and presenting this documentation, despite the personal cost, honours Sir Reginald's sacrifice and ensures that the victims' families will finally receive both truth and compensation. As we made our way through London's gradually clearing streets, the first rays of winter sunlight began to penetrate the dissipating clouds, casting long shadows that seemed to symbolize the end of the storm that had provided such perfect concealment for this extraordinary drama of crime, conscience, and ultimate redemption. The case of the man who smiled in the blizzard had revealed depths of human complexity that challenged even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction, leading us to a resolution that satisfied both the demands of justice and the profound psychological truths that drive men to their most desperate and noble acts. Holmes had solved not merely a murder, but a profound moral puzzle that demonstrated how guilt and redemption could transform even the most calculating criminal mind into an instrument of justice. Sir Reginald's enigmatic smile would no longer haunt my thoughts, for I finally understood it as the expression of a man who had found peace through the ultimate sacrifice, trading his life for the promise that justice would finally reach those who had escaped it for far too long. The formalities at Scotland Yard consumed the remainder of the afternoon, yet they proved as illuminating as our dramatic confrontation at Shadwell Basin. Inspector Lestrade, initially overwhelmed by the extraordinary revelations, quickly recovered his professional composure and set about extracting detailed confessions from our captured conspirators. Draper, faced with the irrefutable photographic evidence, abandoned his earlier protestations and provided a comprehensive account of the maritime fraud network that extended far beyond anything we had initially suspected. By Lestrade's request, we returned that evening to Ravenshollow Manor for an official reconstruction of Sir Reginald's elaborate final performance, the Thaw. The team had begun in earnest, creating a thin glaze upon the snow that crackled beneath our feet, as we approached the imposing Georgian structure. In the study where we had first encountered that enigmatic smile, Holmes proceeded to demonstrate with meticulous precision how Sir Reginald had orchestrated his own demise. The mechanical aspects were elegantly simple, yet psychologically sophisticated, Holmes explained, indicating the narrow guide hole cut with surgical precision at the back of the mahogany desk. Sir Reginald spent weeks perfecting this arrangement, ensuring that every element would create the appearance of impossible murder, while guaranteeing the weapon's complete destruction. He showed us the scorched brass clamp we had discovered among the fireplace implements, explaining how it had secured the revolver at precisely the correct angle beneath the desk. A waxed silk thread, doubled for strength and treated with bergamot oil for flexibility, had been led from the trigger mechanism through the prepared guide and into the grate, where it was secured to a weighted coil concealed within specially prepared ashes. When Sir Reginald completed his final letter, his confession and testament to Mr. Vale, he activated the device himself, Holmes continued with characteristic precision. The recoil drew the weapon backward through the prepared opening in the desk's rear panel, where it plunged among coals treated with chemicals that would consume metal as thoroughly as wood. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with evident emotion as Holmes concluded his mechanical demonstration. Sir Reginald seemed almost peaceful in his final days, as if some great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He spoke repeatedly of settling accounts and ensuring that justice would finally reach those who deserved it most. I knelt beside the chair where Sir Reginald had died, my medical training compelling me to address the psychological impossibility that had so disturbed us initially. The serenity of that expression was indeed genuine, I explained to the assembled group. Death can fix the features in whatever emotion most immediately precedes it, and Sir Reginald's mind was possessed entirely of his redemptive purpose at the crucial moment. Yet there was also careful preparation. Mr. Pemberton has admitted to supporting the jaw with a folded cravat and smoothing the brow to preserve the peace he believed his master had finally achieved. Pemberton nodded slowly, his features reflecting the exhaustion of carrying such an extraordinary secret. It seemed fitting that he should be remembered not for the crimes that had tormented his conscience, but for the justice he finally chose to serve. The photographic evidence that Pemberton had so carefully preserved proved to be the key that unlocked a conspiracy of staggering proportions. The glass plates contained irrefutable documentation of systematic fraud extending throughout London's maritime, insurance industry, forged manifests, falsified cargo records, correspondence detailing substantial bribes to customs officials, and even photographic proof of empty holds on vessels subsequently reported as total losses. Within days of our arrests at Shadwell Basin, the investigation had expanded to encompass corruption that reached from common dock workers to members of Parliament. The insurance fraud involving the Cassandra proved to be merely one incident among dozens, representing systematic theft that had cost hundreds of lives while enriching men who viewed human existence as acceptable commercial losses. Sir Reginald recognized that conventional prosecution would prove inadequate against men of such wealth and influence, Holmes observed, as we reviewed the mounting evidence. His orchestrated death ensured thorough investigation, while his public remorse guaranteed that the victims' families would finally receive both truth and substantial compensation. The legal proceedings that followed validated Sir Reginald's extraordinary gamble in every particular. Captain Silas Reed received official commendation for his investigation of the Cassandra incident, while the recovered assets of the convicted conspirators provided substantial compensation for the families of victims from multiple fraudulent sinkings. Sir Reginald's estate, administered according to the sealed instructions found in his desk, established a permanent fund for the support of mariners' families affected by criminal negligence in the shipping industry. Mr. Vale, the solicitor, discovered among Sir Reginald's papers a deed of gift executed 2 days before the storm, establishing preliminary trusts for the dependents of those lost aboard the Cassandra and 3 other vessels. While it did not reach as far as the proposed codicil would have extended, it provided the probate court with solid foundation for interpreting the testator's final intentions. As we settled before our fire at Baker Street on the evening following the case's official conclusion, Holmes reflected upon the profound moral complexities that had driven this extraordinary investigation to its resolution. The winter storm had finally passed entirely, leaving London's streets clear beneath a canopy of stars that seemed to illuminate not merely our familiar surroundings but the deeper truths about human nature that the case had revealed. "The smile, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight, was indeed the key to understanding the true nature of this remarkable case. Sir Reginald died not as the victim of conventional murder, but as the architect of justice, a man who found peace through ensuring that his own crimes would finally receive appropriate punishment while guaranteeing that innocent victims would achieve both recognition and recompense. I found myself profoundly moved by the psychological sophistication required for such an undertaking. Sir Reginald had not merely planned his own death, he had orchestrated an elaborate moral drama designed to achieve justice through ultimate personal sacrifice, transforming guilt into redemption and death into the instrument of righteousness. The case challenged our fundamental understanding of criminal behavior, I observed, still awed by the complexity of what we had witnessed. The rules by which this particular game was played extended far beyond ordinary detection into realms of conscience and moral philosophy. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his remarkable mind already turning toward other puzzles that awaited our attention. "Indeed, my dear Watson, we have witnessed how the most calculating criminal mind can be transformed by conscience into an instrument of justice. Sir Reginald Blackwood achieved in death what he could never have accomplished in life, the complete exposure of systematic corruption and the promise that justice would finally reach those who had escaped it for far too long. The case of the man who smiled in the blizzard had reached its extraordinary conclusion, revealing depths of human complexity that satisfied both the demands of logic and the profound moral truths that drive men to their most desperate and noble acts. The game had indeed been afoot, but the ultimate victory belonged not to the detective who solved the puzzle, but to the man who had chosen redemption over comfort, justice over survival, and the welfare of innocent victims over his own continued existence. As London settled into peaceful slumber beyond our windows, I reflected that we had been privileged to witness one of the most psychologically sophisticated crimes in the annals of detection, a case where the victim proved to be the hero, the crime scene a stage for moral drama, and justice itself the ultimate beneficiary of an impossible murder that was, in truth, the most noble suicide ever conceived by a tormented conscience seeking final peace. The weeks that followed brought swift vindication of Sir Reginald's extraordinary gamble, though the full magnitude of his achievement became apparent only as the legal proceedings unfolded with relentless precision. The photographic evidence that Pemberton had so meticulously preserved proved to be the cornerstone of prosecutions that reached into the highest echelons of London's commercial establishment, exposing corruption that had festered beneath the respectable veneer of maritime commerce for decades. Holmes maintained his characteristic detachment from the public acclaim that surrounded our investigation, though I observed him following the subsequent trials with unusual interest. Each conviction validated Sir Reginald's faith in the ultimate triumph of justice over influence and wealth, transforming what had initially appeared to be an impossible murder into the most sophisticated instrument of moral retribution either of us had ever witnessed. Draper's comprehensive confession, extracted under the weight of irrefutable evidence, revealed the conspiracy's staggering scope: systematic fraud involving dozens of vessels, hundreds of forged documents, and bribes extending from common dock workers to members of Parliament. The insurance settlements alone totalled nearly £500,000, while the human cost included the lives of more than 300 mariners whose deaths had been dismissed as acceptable commercial losses. Captain Reed received appointment as maritime inspector for the newly established Victims' Compensation Board, a position that allowed him to continue investigating suspicious vessel losses while ensuring proper support for bereaved families. His testimony during the trials proved instrumental in securing convictions against the network of officials who had enabled such systematic destruction of human life for commercial gain. Pemberton faced charges for his role in the elaborate deception, yet the court recognized the extraordinary circumstances that had driven his actions. His sentence was suspended in recognition of his cooperation and the evidence he provided that ensured justice for the conspiracy's victims. Upon his release, he established himself as a legal photographer, using skills developed during his years of secret documentation to serve the cause of justice rather than concealment. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the disinherited cousin, surprised everyone by publicly endorsing Sir Reginald's final testament when its implications became known. "My cousin achieved in death what none of us accomplished in life," she declared to the press. "He chose conscience over comfort and justice over survival. His wealth will serve those who suffered for his earlier failures, and I am proud to bear his name." The maritime reforms that followed Sir Reginald's revelations transformed shipping practices throughout the empire, establishing new standards for cargo verification, insurance claims, and the protection of mariners' families. The Blackwood Foundation, administered according to his sealed instructions, provided ongoing support for victims of commercial negligence while funding investigations into suspicious maritime incidents. Most significantly, the case established legal precedent for prosecuting systematic fraud as a form of murder when it deliberately places innocent lives at risk for commercial gain. The conviction secured through Sir Reginald's evidence ensured that future conspiracies would face charges not merely for theft, but for the human costs of their criminal enterprises. As spring arrived and London emerged from winter's grip, Holmes and I found ourselves reflecting upon the profound moral complexities that had driven this extraordinary case to its resolution. The familiar routine of our Baker Street chambers provided welcome respite from the intense scrutiny, allowing us to process the deeper implications of what we had witnessed. The case challenged every assumption I had formed about the nature of criminal behavior, Watson, Holmes observed during one of our evening discussions, his pipe casting familiar shadows in the firelight. Sir Reginald demonstrated that guilt can be transformed into the most powerful weapon against injustice, while conscience can drive even the most calculating mind to acts of supreme nobility. I found myself equally moved by the psychological sophistication required for such an undertaking. The smile that initially disturbed us so profoundly proved to be the key to understanding the entire mystery. It was indeed the expression of a man who had found peace through ensuring that his own crimes would receive appropriate punishment while guaranteeing that innocent victims would achieve recognition and recompense. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "The human heart, when pushed to its limits of guilt and despair, can conceive acts of such profound complexity that they defy conventional understanding. Sir Reginald transcended mere suicide. He orchestrated a grand moral drama, using his death as the ultimate instrument of justice." The smile was not triumph over enemies, but triumph over himself. As I complete this account of one of the most extraordinary cases in my long partnership with Sherlock Holmes, I am struck by the profound truth that Sir Reginald's story reveals about the nature of redemption itself. He discovered that wealth acquired through others' suffering becomes a burden that can only be lifted through sacrifice, and that true justice sometimes requires the ultimate personal cost. The man who smiled in the blizzard achieved immortality not through the commercial empire he had built, but through the moral courage he displayed in its destruction. His enigmatic expression, which had initially seemed so disturbing, proved to be the serene countenance of a soul finally at peace with itself and confident in the righteousness of its chosen path. Holmes never claimed credit for solving the psychological puzzle that had initially seemed impossible, preferring to emphasize Sir Reginald's own role in orchestrating the revelation of truth. "The greatest detective work," he observed, "sometimes consists merely of recognizing when someone has already solved their own case and arranged for justice to be served." Years later, when visitors to our chambers inquired about our most memorable cases, Holmes would often direct their attention to a small daguerreotype that occupied a place of honor upon our mantelpiece. It showed the merchant vessel Cassandra in her final voyage, her crew standing proudly upon deck, unaware of the fate that awaited them through the machinations of men who valued profit over human life. "That vessel," Holmes would explain, "represents both the greatest crime and the most noble redemption I have encountered in my career. The man who caused her destruction ultimately chose to sacrifice everything to ensure that justice would reach those who had escaped it for far too long." The photograph served as a constant reminder that the most complex mysteries often spring not from external circumstances, but from the profound moral struggles that define the human condition. Sir Reginald Blackwood had indeed found peace in the blizzard, and his smile would forever represent the triumph of conscience over comfort, justice over survival, and redemption over despair. The case remained, in Holmes's estimation, the perfect demonstration that truth and justice, however long delayed, will ultimately prevail when driven by the irresistible force of human conscience awakened to its moral obligations. The game had been afoot from the moment Sir Reginald chose redemption over survival, and we had been privileged to witness the final act of a moral drama that transformed guilt into the instrument of righteousness, ensuring that his crimes would receive appropriate punishment while guaranteeing that innocent victims would achieve both recognition and lasting recompense. As London settled into the peaceful rhythms of spring, the case of the man who smiled in the blizzard stood as testament to the enduring power of human conscience to transform even the most calculating criminal mind into an agent of justice, proving that redemption remains possible even for those who believe themselves beyond forgiveness.